In this session, we're going to be looking at the elementary spelling inventory from Words Their Way, as well as looking at the stages of spelling development. So you really want to have access to two things during this time. You might want to have access to the elementary spelling inventory that can be found on Blackboard under Assessments. Here we have not only instructions for giving the spelling inventory as well as directions for using the feature guide, but the spelling words themselves as well as list of sentences to help during the spelling test, or I really hate saying spelling test, spelling inventory. And then the feature guide that we'll look a little bit more closely at towards the end of today's session. Also, you might want to have Words Their Way Chapter 1 that you can find under articles, because I'm going to be referring quite a bit to the various tables that are found within the chapter as we talk about each spelling stage. So why is it important to look at a child's spelling development? Well, a child's spelling is often indicative of their understanding of how written English words work. In the names test, we looked at how well or to what degree or what patterns our children have internalized with regard to decoding. But when we look at their spelling, we look at what patterns, phonetic patterns, have they internalized with regard to encoding or spelling. Oftentimes we see that a child's spelling may lag behind a child's reading, and that's fairly normal. But we also know that when we look at their spelling development, we look at sort of the notion of what sort of stage they are, it can help inform and focus both our word study instruction and our writing instruction. Specifically our word study instruction, because we know that the traditional view of spelling is not the best way to help kids with their spelling. The notion of giving kids a disconnected word list on Monday, testing them on Friday, and then forgetting about it throughout the week is not very helpful in helping build students' vocabularies as well as their spelling repertoire. But if we use words in our spelling lists that are connected to what we're reading as well as connected to the word study instruction that is going on in the classroom, we know that our students' vocabularies can increase, and we also know that they become risk takers with regard to spelling in their writing. Sometimes we see children's writing not necessarily reflect their receptive or expressive vocabularies, but when they are given focused word study instruction as well as connected spelling work to what they're reading, we found that children are more risk takers in their writing, and that their writing is more reflective of their expressive vocabularies because they have the tools that they need. They understand the way that written English words work by their patterns, etc. And so they're more willing to spell them in their writing and less frustrated when it comes time to writing. So we consider all three of these things when reasons why to look at spelling development. Bear et al. In Chapter 1 of Words Their Way sort of explained to us that there are 5 stages with regard to spelling and reading. And we're going to talk about each of those stages and the characteristics of each, and we're going to look specifically at the tables embedded within the chapter. But the first stage is emergent. Emergent, these are typically our little guys, 0 to 5 years old. However, it's important to understand that emergent spelling at times has been dismissed as not spelling traditionally, but really it is the children's ability to understand that the print and the symbols, whether it be letters or numbers around them, can be written, and that those written symbols have meaning. And so this is the early stages of not only spelling but also reading. And so we see lots of scribbling, we see not really, in early emergent, they lack the concept of a word. As they progress in mid to late emergent, you may see that there are some salient sounds represented with single letters. And we certainly see lots of pretending to read and write. However, it's not just pretending. They are becoming readers and writers in those early years. And that's why work in pre-Ks, even earlier than pre-Ks, is so crucial and important, because we want children to see themselves as readers and writers through those scribbles. So if you look at table 1-1 on page 11, you can see some of those characteristics of emergent spellers. We see it into early, middle, and emergent. And one thing I want to direct your attention to is under a late emergent, the thing that students use but often confuse are sometimes substitutions of letters or often letter reversals. We have several letters in the English language, such as P, B, D. And when we see these letters, either in uppercase or lowercase, as children are learning those concepts, they often use and confuse them. You may see letter reversals. You may see children using a B where it's actually a D. And a lot of that is it's taking them a little bit more time to process which letter, which shape, which formation goes with which sound, and vice versa. So that's very age appropriate. That's not necessarily something to be worried about, particularly in those early ages. And sometimes we even see that carry on for children who are striving to meet their reading and spelling goals up until about 7-8 years. Also, if you flip the page to page 12, you can also see in figure 1-4 some examples of emergent writing. You can see A being very early emergent, moving from B to C, probably mid-emergent, to D being late emergent, noticing that they're spelling, simple, predictable words conventionally, but also adding in those tadpole drawings. The next letter stage is the next spelling stage is the letter name stage. And this is characterized by the attempt to match alphabetic letters to salient phonemes, that is, most predictable phonemes, typically the initial sounds and the ending sounds within the words being spelled. Now, it's important to understand this is typically ages 5 to 8, although a beginning reader and speller, even as the book points out, you could be 50, 55 years old, but beginning to learn English, that you could be within the letter name stage. So we often see this with some of our English language learners, even though they may be older, they may be within the letter name stage with regard to spelling. In the early letter name stage, as you can see on page 14 in table 1-2, early we typically see beginning and ending sounds. We see sort of the functional concept of a word, and they're typically reading and spelling words and beginning reading materials, but vowels are often omitted. However, as they move to middle to late letter name, we start to see vowels. Sometimes those vowels are not perhaps the conventional vowel used. Like in the table we have bad for bed. The student is acknowledging that there is a vowel sound, but kind of unsure which letter makes the sound. And once again, we also see some silent letters being omitted, which I actually see that in older children's spelling sometimes too. And as they, with regard to their reading, they're definitely glued to the print. Okay, this is in child stages. We're thinking about that early reading where they're finger pointing, they're reading aloud, they're using their decoding skills, they read slowly, word by word. They're glued to the print. However, as children progress in both their reading and spelling, they move to sort of what's called the within word pattern. This is typically children who are 7 to 10 years old, so are mid-elementary grades. They spell most single word short vowel words correctly. And as you can see on page 16, in table 1-3, we see once again the early, the middle, and the late. In the early, we see the ability to spell the initial and final consonants, as well as some of the regular short vowel patterns. But they may be having difficulty using long vowel markers. They may be overusing the vowel consonant E pattern, or they may be misplacing vowel patterns, because at this time they're learning all the different vowel patterns, which in English there are quite a few. So VCE is often taught early on, and so you can see in the early within word stage they're overusing that. Even within middle word stage they're overusing it, but this tends to sort of iron itself out as they learn inflectional suffixes like ed and s. As they move to those sort of patterns, vowel patterns start to iron themselves out. With regard to reading, this is where children are starting to read silently, more fluently, more expression, and reading for pleasure. With regard to writing, they're also able to revise and edit. As children move along in reading and spelling stages to ages about 9 to 14, so our intermediate middle school grades, we typically see children within the syllables and affixes stage. And you can see on table 1.4 on page 18 the characteristics here of individuals or children who are in the syllables and affixes spelling stage. So we see that they're spelling most single syllable words correctly, but the errors start to take place in multisyllabic words at the syllable juncture. So for instance, you can see in happiness they've got the Y. They just need to learn that rule. Drop the Y, add the I. They are also, once again, reading with good fluency and expression, so they're encountering more multisyllabic words in their reading. And they read faster silently than orally, and their written responses are more sophisticated and critical. With regard to their spelling errors, you tend to see just having difficulty forming at that syllable juncture. And oftentimes it's learning those spelling rules that come along with things like dropping or doubling consonants, as well as what to do with the vowel when you drop them. And also learning word origins. And that's where the next stage sort of takes place, that derivational stage. At this point, adolescents at this point have mastered high-frequency words, and those are spelled often, but they're making errors on low-frequency multisyllabic words that have Latin and Greek combining forms. This is typically where we have our root word with our prefix and our suffix. And so not only are our words multisyllabic, but they're also more difficult to spell, because depending upon the root word and the combining form. So as you can see on page 20 on table 1-5, you can see the characteristics of derivational relation spelling. And some of our students may be at this point, but for the most part, most of our students are not. This is typically where we see late middle school, high school. It all depends. Some children who really excel in reading and spelling may be in this derivational stage, 4th, 5th grade, but typically this is middle school and high school. And even some of us would say that we're in the derivational stage. So what do we need in order to administer the Words Their Way spelling inventory? Well, you need your word list, as well as the feature guide once you've administered it. So let's look really closely at those items. This is the spelling list. You need the spelling list, and then you'll need a piece of notebook paper and a pencil for your student. Typically how this is given is you will read through each set of the words. The student hits sort of the time that you want to stop the student is when they miss 3 or more of the words out of the set of 5. So for instance, you could start with the first set. Always administer the first set all the way through. Look to see, have they missed more than 3? If they had, then you can stop there. If they haven't, then go on. So you want to stop at the point where they've missed 3 or more of each set. I would really suggest that you use this format, sort of the traditional spelling test format when administering this. First by saying the word bed, and then reading the sentence. I hopped out of bed this morning. Bed. So you're giving them 3 opportunities to hear the word, which is going to be much more important as we go further down and see words, encounter words such as cellar. It's going to be important that we give them the meaning, embed the meaning within the sentence, because cellar could be S-E-L-L-E-R versus the cellar here, where we're talking about the actual place, not the person. So this is the spelling inventory word list. Once you have administered the assessment, you will use the feature guide to help you score. Now, I say score lightly because we're not as much interested in giving a concrete score to this as we are looking at the features in which they spell words correctly or conventionally. So for instance, doing sort of like we did with the names test, we'll look. We can check, put a check next to each area in which they spell correctly. So let's say that our student spells bed, B-E-D. They spell the entire thing conventionally. So put a check by B, put a check by D, put a check by E. Okay, and we go forth. Let's say that our student spells the word float, F-L-O-T-E. So they got the F-L, the initial blend correct, so we put a check there. But they had trouble with that long vowel pattern, so we want to circle that there, okay? That's really all that I'm interested in you all doing up until this point, until the following week after you've administered the assessment and you've done the feature guide with regard to checking and circling based on things that they did conventionally or things that they didn't demonstrate. And then we're going to look at sort of how we can tell what stage they're in from this. You can also at the bottom total up based on your check marks how many they got correct within those features. So for instance, if they spelled bed correctly and they spelled lump, let's say they spelled it L-U-P, we would add up the L for the initial so that they would get 2 out of 2 here. But perhaps over here we would circle that because they forgot the N, so they wouldn't get that correct. So you can do the totals down here at the bottom if you'd like. That will just be helpful with regard to feature points. But hopefully together we can look at the patterns that we see and try to figure out which spelling stage they are in. Whether they're emergent, letter name, within words, syllable and affixes, derivational, and where they fall within that. Okay, well, I'm looking forward to this assessment. This assessment paired with the names test can really give us some rich phonics knowledge with regard to what they're decoding and what they are encoding. So please be prepared to have the spelling list for yourself as well as a piece of notebook paper and a pencil for your student. I would suggest if you feel like your student may have directional issues or may have difficulty writing on smaller notebook paper that you bring bigger notebook paper. If you don't have any notebook paper, bigger notebook paper, you can always make some on Word by spacing, by just creating larger spaces in between your lines. So look forward to it.